We teach people to live by a guiding question. We say it's just simple to ask, what does love require of me in this situation?
Hello, we're beginning a new study on the book of Hebrews. What's interesting about the book of Hebrews is most people who study the scripture will tell you it is probably the second hardest book in the New Testament to study. First being Revelation, in the sense that there's a lot of unknown and pieces that we have to figure out that tie into the Old Testament and unknown future. Hebrews, on the other hand, has so much background biblical commentary and so much specific knowledge to the Judaic temple that it's difficult for an average person to open up and read. What we wanted to do was say, how do we make this complicated book less complicated? The first thing you got to do when studying the scripture is ask, what did the passage mean to the original audience? Well, therefore, you have to know a little bit about the original audience. Now, the book of Hebrews is interesting in that we don't know who the author is. We have all kinds of guesses. Many people say it's Paul, but if you actually study the syntax of the passage and the writing, you go, okay, it's not Paul. That's not the way he normally speaks. Though the person probably knew Paul and knew of his writings, and Paul has some heavy influence on the author of the book. Some people say Apollos, that is mentioned by Paul in the scripture, and that probably is a likely candidate. At the end of the day, we don't know. What we do know is that the early church accepted it as part of the canon, again, the New Testament, if you will, very early on. In fact, by 110, we have early church fathers citing the book of Hebrews as scripture. And so the argument that, hey, we don't know who the author is, therefore how can we trust this? Well, the early church fathers, who probably knew who the author was but didn't think it important to mention, already by the first century believed that, hey, this book was canon and was important enough to quote and to use as they preached, taught, and wrote to other people, citing it as scripture with scriptural authority. And so the early church has viewed the book of Hebrews, which was written to a group of Hebrews very early on, as authoritative and part of the canon. Now, we've already said it was written to a group of Hebrews, but they weren't just Hebrews, they were Hebrews who had converted to Christianity. But then there was an intense persecution that broke out all around what then would have been known as the modern world, the Roman world. And what happened was there was this real intense persecution of the Christian church. And so what you have is you have these group of Jews who are not living in Jerusalem but somewhere else. This is after the temple fall, probably around 80 to 90 AD when the book was written. And you have a group of Christians who were Jews, who were faithful Jews, who converted because they thought Jesus fulfilled the law and covenant and was the way, who then became under intense persecution. And the author of the book of Hebrews is encouraging them to stay with the faith. Don't give up and don't go back to the ways of Judaism. Stay with Christianity. And so it's also a great book to use with some of our Jewish friends who understand their history, and we could say, see how Jesus fulfills and moves forward this into the supreme fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy. In fact, if there was one central theme to the book of Hebrews, it would be this: Christ is superior in his person and work. Again, the theme of the book of Hebrews, if you had to pick one, it would be Christ is superior in his person and work. Christ is much better. Christ is greater than all else. Now, why is that important? Well, let's move into some why we're going to apply this immediately. Look, if you're going through a difficult time, if you're questioning whether God is for you or against you, if you're questioning, hey, is God big enough to handle my problems? Well, this was written to a group of people who literally were watching their friends be tortured and killed for their faith. One author writes about Rome being lit up by the bodies of Christians who had been tarred and put in cages and then mounted up as streetlights and set on fire. And he writes saying that the light of the world, Christians, were truly the light of Rome as they, with their bodies being consumed by fire, lit up Rome. Now, we have all kinds of historical context around that with Nero and the great persecution of the church. But what I would say to you is that if you're going through a difficult time, the book of Hebrews is a great place to start if you can gather into context. Because to the original audience, the author's going, I know things are bad. I know things are rough. I know it's not good. Don't give up on the faith. And this is why. Why? Because Christ is superior in his person and work. This is true. You can stake literally your very life on it. Don't give up on the faith. So we're going to look at Hebrews 1 today. I invite you to have a Bible and open it up with us. Hebrews 1. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers. Well, how do you do that? Well, immediately the author of the book of Hebrews is referencing what? The Old Testament, the sayings of the prophets. And so we have the author who says, yes, this was valid. The Old Testament was and is still valid. And in the past, this is how God spoke. Now, your next question will be, okay, if that's how he spoke to our forefathers through the prophets, how does he speak to us? The author goes on. He spoke through the prophets many times and in various ways. But in these last days, I've circled last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So in these last days, the author of Hebrews isn't trying to make an apocalyptic statement that, hey, this is the end. We're being persecuted. This is the end. As much as he's saying, look, God spoke previously through the prophets. Now Christ has come. He's spoken through Christ. That is how God is speaking now. And the last days, meaning that Christ has come, so now we're moving forward in this time period when Jesus has already come. God has invaded the earth. He says he spoke to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things. So Christ is the heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. Now pause. We have a moment where we got to pause and say, how big is Jesus? And we have this connection all the way to the back to the Gospel of John, where in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word is God, and through whom all things are made. Again, we have this omni-God. We have this big, big God that often, when we're going through difficult circumstances, we forget how big God is. And God is so big that he already knows all of history all at once. Why? Because he's outside of time, space, and matter. And so God doesn't learn things in sequential order. God doesn't experience things in sequential order. God is all things, though God isn't connected to all things. God is the sustainer and creator of all things. We're not going into pantheism or panentheism, where God literally is everything. But rather, God is in all things, and that he is the sustainer and creator. He is that cause which makes everything be. And in that, God knows all of human history in a moment. Just as if you and I read a novel, we can recall the whole thing in an instance. We don't have to sit there in our mind and go through chapter by chapter by chapter and go, each time we think about the novel, go, oh yeah, I forgot how it ended. That was a surprise ending, even in my head, even though I've read it. We know the whole novel all at once. God knows all of human history all at once. Now again, that's a big deal. Why? Well, because we got to remember how big God is. And the author of Hebrews wants to start out by saying, Christ is this big. Your problems may be here, but Christ is this big. He can handle everything and will handle everything. There's nothing going on that ever surprises God. There's nothing that goes on that shocks God. There's nothing that goes on that scares God or frightens God. Why? Because God knows all things all at once, and for God, all human history has already passed, and he's hanging out in heaven with us in eternity. He goes on and says, through whom he made the universe, verse 3. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. Now, the exact representation, the word here that's used is to remind us that, like, you would stamp a coin and you would put an image of somebody on there. And if it was a good picture, it would be an exact representation. The author is saying when Jesus came, he was the exact stamp of what God would look like. Now, he's not talking about a physical appearance. Again, don't limit God in that sense, but rather Jesus behaved and worked in such a way that he did exactly what God would have done and did do, since God came to earth, fully human, fully God, fully man in Jesus Christ, right? And so we have this moment where Christ is superior and is God. He is the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things. Well, what does that mean? Christ is the sustainer of all things. Well, Christ sustains what? He sustains all creation, just as a musician sustains the music. The musician makes the music happen. If the musician stops, the musician doesn't disappear, the music stops. Christ is sustaining all things, just as the musician sustains the music. After he had provided purification for sins, again, we got to pause. We have this atonement message right here at the very beginning. The author wants you to know the reason Jesus came. All right, we have this atonement message. After he provided purification, he sat down at the right hand of majesty in heaven. Remember, John in the gospel says, with Jesus on the cross, quotes Jesus saying, "It is finished." The atonement, the price is done, right? So he became as much superior to even the angels. Now, pause. Here's where some people have said, hey, there's some angelic worship going on in the culture of Jews at the time that the author of Hebrews is speaking against. And he's not really speaking against that, though there is angelic worship amongst all cultures. And so if you were a practicing Jew, you didn't worship the angels, but you understood them as messengers from God. But the culture all around has these little gods or little angels that they're worshiping. And again, the author of Hebrews wants to take a swipe at that and say, look, even compared to all other gods or angelic beings, Christ is what? What was the theme? Superior in his person and work to theirs. So we pause there. And we start the book of Hebrews and go, hey, in the very first section, which by the way, in the Greek, verse 1 through 4 is all one amazing sentence. In fact, if you study Greek intensely, you have to translate this passage because it's so beautiful. And here's what we would say to you. If you're looking and saying, my life's difficult, my life's hard, just pause and remember that Christ is superior. He's gigantic. He's big. He's bigger than anything. He's outside of time, space, and matter. Your God is omnipresent. Your God is omniscient. Your God is powerful, more powerful than anything that rises against him. Now, the other thing we have to pause and remember is the author of Hebrews doesn't promise. Therefore, life's going to be good and none of you are ever going to be tortured or persecuted or harmed. That's not a promise ever made in the Bible. There's no prosperity gospel in Scripture. The message is Christ is superior. So no matter what happens, no matter what you're going through, first of all, it doesn't impact God's goodness. Second of all, no matter what you're going through, the end victory is already yours. Christ is superior to everything, including the enemy which is attacking you, including that relationship that you thought destroyed you, including that bankruptcy you're going through, including that job loss you're going through, including that persecution you may be going through, including whatever situation that you may be facing wherever you are in the world. Maybe it might be actual physical life and death persecution. Christ is superior to the work of Satan. There is nothing bigger than the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And that is what the author of Hebrews says. Turn your eyes and focus on Jesus. And as the old song says, the things of the world will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. So turn your eyes upon Jesus.